Did he know he was running out of time? When he sang My Way with such finality, was he singing to his audience or to himself? When his voice, once a playful tenor, deepened into a cavernous baritone, was it just age, or was it the sound of a body breaking down? Why did a man who had everything choose to sing songs about having nothing left to lose? The last few years of Elvis Presley's life are not just a story of fame and excess. They are a story told in the music itself, in the cracks of his voice, in the weight of his words, and in the space between the notes. His later works are a hidden diary of a man watching his own clock wind down. Number 20, why did his final performance feel like a goodbye? In Rapid City, South Dakota, on June 21st, 1977, a camera crew was present to film what would become part of a TV special. Elvis Presley had only 2 months left to live. He had canceled 28 shows in the previous 12 months due to health issues. The set list for his final shows was almost identical to the ones he performed in 1975, a sign of creative stagnation. The final song filmed that night was Unchained Melody. It wasn't a raucous rock and roll number. It wasn't a triumphant anthem. It was a plea. A raw, desperate, and heartbreaking performance. Elvis sat at the piano. He was not the leather rock star of the 1950s. He was a 42-year-old man in a state of visible physical distress. His face was puffy. He was sweating profusely under the stage lights, the moisture clinging to his dark hair. His bejeweled white jumpsuit, the kind that once defined his powerful stage presence, now seemed to contain a man struggling against its weight. He wasn't a great piano player. He knew a few chords, enough to accompany himself, and that's what he did. He told his guitarist, Charlie Hodge, to hold the microphone for him. He needed both hands for the piano, but more than that, he seemed to need the support. He was physically and emotionally exposed. He started the song, and the voice that came out was not the voice of the king of rock and roll. It was the voice of a man at the end of his rope. It was immense, a deep baritone full of sorrow and power. The famous vibrato was wider, almost a tremble. It sounded like he was on the verge of tears. When he reached the song's crescendo, the famous line, "I need your love," he wasn't just singing lyrics. It felt like a confession. His eyes were squeezed shut. He leaned into the microphone as if it were a lifeline. The veins in his neck stood out. The sheer effort was immense. This wasn't a performance of slick Vegas showmanship. It was a man pouring every last ounce of his spirit into a song. He was struggling to breathe, gasping for air between the powerful, long notes. The audience was silent, then erupted in applause, but it was a different kind of applause. It wasn't just for a star. It was for a human being showing them his pain. The tragedy of this performance is not just in how he looked, but in what he was communicating. Unchained Melody is a song about longing for a love that is far away. For Elvis, trapped on the road, isolated by fame, and disconnected from his own past, that love could have been anything. It could have been for a person, for his youth, for a time when things were simpler, for a sense of peace he could no longer find. The time he was desperate for was a time he could never get back. His body was a cage and his fame was a cage. And in that moment, at that piano, he sang his way out for just a few minutes. After the song, he stood up. He seemed exhausted, spent. The TV special Elvis in Concert would air 2 months after his death. This performance would become his unofficial eulogy. It was the last time the world saw him sing with that kind of raw, unfiltered emotion. There was no artifice left. There was no rock and roll swagger. There was only a man, a piano, and a song about needing something he had lost. The passage of time was not an abstract concept in that performance. It was written on his face, it was carried in his labored breaths, and it echoed in the heartbreaking power of his voice. It was a farewell, even if no one, perhaps not even he, knew it at the time. Number 19, was he singing about himself in Hurt? Elvis first recorded Hurt, a song made famous by Tina Euro in February 1976. The sessions took place in the Jungle Room, his den at Graceland. He was 41 years old. During the recording of the song's dramatic ending, he threw himself to the floor in a genuine, unstaged collapse of emotion, a move he would later replicate on stage. The single reached the top 10 on the country charts, but its live performance became something else entirely. On stage, Hurt became a piece of high drama. It was a showstopper, but not in a joyful way. It was a spectacle of pain. Elvis would pour everything he had into the song about a man who has lost love and is now tormented by the pain he caused. The lyrics are simple. I'm so hurt to think that you would lie to me. I'm so hurt, much more than you'll ever know. But Elvis didn't just sing them, he acted them out. He embodied the anguish. His performances of the song in his final year are difficult to watch. He would stand center stage, the orchestra swelling behind him. He would deliver the lines with a force that seemed to come from a deep, wounded place. His voice, now a booming, almost operatic baritone, was perfect for the song's melodrama. He would clench his fists. He would grimace. It was pure theater, but it felt deeply real. The song ends with a massive, sustained high note. Elvis would build to it, his whole body tensing, and then unleash it. As the note rang out, he would often drop to one knee, or even fall completely to the stage floor, lying there as if struck down. Was this just showmanship? Elvis was always a master performer. He knew how to command a stage, but this felt different. This wasn't the hip-swiveling confidence of his youth. This was a man publicly displaying his own suffering. The line between Elvis the performer and Elvis the person had become blurry, perhaps non-existent. He had gone through a public and painful divorce from Priscilla in 1973. He was notoriously lonely, surrounded by an entourage but deeply isolated. He was in a state of constant physical pain from a host of ailments. When he sang I'm So Hurt, who was he singing about? Was he singing about Priscilla? Was he singing to his fans about the pain of not being the man they remembered? Was he singing to his younger self, the boy from Tupelo, who could never have imagined this strange, gilded prison of a life? The song became a vessel for all the unspoken pain he was carrying. The physical act of falling to the floor was a visual representation of his internal state. He was falling apart, and he was doing it in front of thousands of people every night. The tragedy is in the repetition. Night after night, he would put himself through this emotional flagellation. It was part of the show, a guaranteed crowd pleaser, but it was also a ritual of self-abasement. He was commodifying his own pain, turning it into another part of the Vegas act. The passage of time had given him the emotional weight to make the song believable, but it had also taken away the physical and emotional resilience to withstand it. Each performance of Hurt was another chip away at his foundation, another public acknowledgement that the king was, in his own words, so very hurt. Number 18, did the jumpsuit become a prison? The first white jumpsuit, designed by Bill Ballou, appeared in 1970. By 1977, Ballou had designed over 100 different suits with names like the Peacock, the American Eagle, and the Sundial. These suits could weigh up to 30 pounds, covered in metal studs, semi-precious stones, and intricate embroidery. They were, in essence, a form of armor. In the early 1970s, the jumpsuits served a purpose. They were, visually spectacular, turning Elvis into a larger-than-life superhero on stage. They allowed for the karate kicks and dramatic poses he incorporated into his act. They accentuated his slim physique and projected an image of immense power and virility. The white color made him stand out against the dark stage like a deity descended. The capes gave him an almost royal imperial presence. He was not just a singer, he was an event. But as time passed, the function of the jumpsuit changed. As Elvis's weight fluctuated, a result of his poor diet and prescription drug use, the suits had to be constantly redesigned. Now, they went from being a symbol of his physical prowess to a means of concealing his physical decline. They were cut to hide his expanding waistline. The high collars hid his neck. The heavy fabric and elaborate designs drew the eye away from the man's changing shape. The armor was no longer just for show, it was for hiding. By 1976 and 1977, the contrast between the glittering costume and the man inside was profound. The suits looked heavy and restrictive. He would sweat so much that the fabric would become soaked, making the already heavy garment even heavier. You could see him laboring to move in them. The karate kicks became slower, more deliberate, and eventually disappeared altogether. He was a prisoner in his own iconic costume. The jumpsuit represented a specific moment in time, the triumphant comeback of the late 60s and early 70s. But, time had moved on and his body had changed. He was a middle-aged man, but he was still dressing up as the superhero he had been 5 or 6 years earlier. It was a form of arrested development, a refusal to acknowledge the passage of time. The world saw the American eagle or the Aztec sundial, but underneath was a man struggling with his health, his loneliness, and the immense pressure of being Elvis Presley. The tragedy of the jumpsuit is that it was a cage of his own making. It was part of the brand, the spectacle that people paid to see. He couldn't just walk out on stage in a simple shirt and pants. He had to be the larger-than-life king. The suit was a promise of the old magic, a magic he increasingly struggled to conjure. It was a constant physical reminder of the man he was supposed to be, even as the man he actually was found it harder and harder to bear the weight. You know, it was a beautiful, glittering prison he wore every night. Number 17, what did the Jungle Room sessions really capture? In February and October of 1976, RCA brought a mobile recording truck to Graceland. They parked it outside and ran cables into the den, a room Elvis had decorated with green shag carpet, a built-in stone waterfall, and heavy Polynesian-style furniture. It was nicknamed the Jungle Room. This is where Elvis Presley would record his final studio albums from Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee, and Moody Blue. He was 41 years old. He had not been in a formal recording studio since 1975. He no longer had the will or the energy to go to a studio, so the studio came to him. These sessions were not the disciplined hit-making affairs of his son or early RCA days. They were loose, often chaotic. Elvis was the master of his own domain, which meant the sessions ran on his schedule. He would record late at night, surrounded by his entourage. He would choose the songs based on his mood, often picking somber country and pop ballads. The atmosphere was relaxed, but also heavy. The recordings captured something raw and unfiltered. His voice was the star. Without the pressure of a formal studio, he sang with a deep, emotional honesty. The voice itself was a marvel. It was lower, richer, and more powerful than ever. But it was also a tired voice. You can hear the weariness in it, the mileage of thousands of performances and countless sleepless nights. It's the voice of a man who has lived a lot and is feeling the weight of it all. The song choices are revealing. He recorded Waylon Jennings' Hurt, Neil Sedaka's Solitaire, and the heartbreaking Danny Boy. These are not songs of youthful rebellion. They are songs of regret, loneliness, and loss. Solitaire is about a man completely alone, playing a game by himself. There was a man, a lonely man, who lost his love through his indifference. When Elvis sings that line, the boundary between the singer and the song dissolves. He was living that reality, surrounded by people in his own home, yet profoundly alone. The sound of the Jungle Room sessions is also telling. The production is simple. It's the sound of a band playing together in a room. You can hear the room itself in the recordings. It's intimate, almost claustrophobic. This wasn't the slick, polished sound of Nashville or Hollywood. It was the sound of a man confronting his own music and perhaps his own mortality in the comfort and confinement of his own home. He was literally singing from inside his own fortress. The tragedy of these sessions is twofold. First, they captured a voice that was still magnificent, but a spirit that was fading. The power was there, but the joy was often gone, replaced by a deep melancholy. He could still sing anything, but he chose to sing about sadness. Second, these were his last. He would never enter a recording studio again. The creative well was running dry. The man who had revolutionized popular music was now content to record covers of sad songs in his den. The passage of time is audible in these recordings. It is in the timbre of his voice, the choice of his songs, and the very fact that he could no longer bring himself to leave his home to make music. It was the last testament of a brilliant fading star. Number 16 was My Way, a Cry for Help or a Statement of Pride. Elvis Presley began performing My Way, the song famously associated with Frank Sinatra during his 1973 Aloha from Hawaii concert. It quickly became a staple of his live shows and a dramatic, emotional centerpiece. By the end of his life, it had taken on an almost unbearable poignancy. He performed it during his final concert tour. The lyrics, written by Paul Anka, speak of a man at the end of his life looking back with defiant pride. And now the end is near. I faced it all, and I stood tall and did it my way. On the surface, it seems like the perfect anthem for Elvis. He was a man who had broken all the rules, created his own style, and lived a life of unprecedented fame on his own terms. When he sang the song with his powerful baritone and the backing of a full orchestra, it was a declaration of his own legend. The audience would roar its approval. It was a confirmation of his status as the king, a man who answered to no one. But beneath the surface, there is a deep and tragic irony. By the mid-1970s, was Elvis truly doing things his way? His life was rigidly structured. He was trapped in a cycle of touring and Las Vegas engagements. His set lists were largely static. His diet, his health, and his daily life were controlled by his addictions and the enabling of those around him. He was a man who had lost control of his own life, yet every night he stood on stage and sang about his own autonomy and strength. In the final performances, his delivery of the song is devastating. Watch the footage from the 1977 TV special. He seems to be pleading with the lyrics as much as he is declaring them. When he sings, "Regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention," it sounds like he's trying to convince himself as much as the audience. His life was filled with regrets, his divorce, his estrangement from his own creative process, his lost health, the movies he hated making. The line feels less like a confident statement and more like a desperate attempt at self-reassurance. The performance became a battle. He would muster all his strength for the song's powerful climax. It was as if he was trying to use the sheer volume and power of his voice to overwhelm the sad reality of his situation. The song is about having no doubts, but his performance was filled with them. It was a man performing a version of himself he no longer was. He was playing the part of the defiant individualist while living the life of a man trapped by his own fame and his own choices. The passage of time had twisted the song's meaning for him. In 1973, it might have been a song of triumph. By 1977, it was a song of desperation. It was a plea to be seen as the master of his own destiny, even as the evidence of his life suggested the opposite. It was less a statement of pride and more a cry for help. A musical mask he wore to hide the fear and regret that came with knowing the end was, in fact, very near. Number 15, why did he stop writing his own songs? Elvis Presley is listed as a co-writer on several of his songs, including Love Me Tender and All Shook Up. However, the truth is that Elvis was not a songwriter. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, demanded that publishing companies give Elvis a co-writing credit, and thus 50% of the royalties for any song he recorded. This practice, common at the time, drove away many talented songwriters, including the legendary team of Lieber and Stoller, who refused to give up half their publishing. Elvis's real genius was not in writing songs, but in interpreting them. He could take a song and make it his own. But the question remains, in the 1970s, as his life became more complex and his emotions more turbulent, why did he never turn to songwriting as an outlet? He was an intelligent, sensitive man who was clearly grappling with deep issues of loneliness, faith, and mortality. Songwriting could have been a powerful form of therapy, a way to process his experiences and communicate them directly to his audience. He had the time, he had the resources, and he certainly had the life experience to draw from. The answer is likely complex. Part of it was habit. He had been a song interpreter his entire career. He relied on a team of people to bring him material. He was a performer first and foremost, not a creator in that specific sense. His creative energy was channeled into his vocal performance and his stage presence. He saw his role as finding the heart of someone else's song and amplifying it for the world. Another part of it may have been a lack of confidence, and he was surrounded by the best professional songwriters in the business. Perhaps he felt he couldn't compete. He was Elvis Presley, the king. The pressure to write a song worthy of his own legend would have been immense. It may have been easier to rely on the proven craftsmanship of others than to risk writing something that didn't measure up. But the most tragic reason might be that he had lost the creative spark, the internal drive to create something new. The passage of time and the toll of his lifestyle had dulled his artistic curiosity. His world had shrunk to his home, his hotel suites, and the stage. He was insulated from the everyday life that inspires so much great songwriting. He was in a creative cocoon, fed a steady diet of songs that fit the Elvis brand. He became a passive receiver of music rather than an active seeker. In his later years, he sang songs that mirrored his life with uncanny accuracy. Songs like Separate Ways, Always on My Mind, and Promised Land all spoke to his personal journey. But they were written by others. He was a man who had lost his own voice. In a literary sense, he could only speak through the words of others. This lack of original material is one of the saddest details of his later career. He had so much to say, but he never found a way to write the words himself. He was left to sing a script written by strangers, a script that by chance or design told the story of his own slow fade. Number 14, did the orchestra drown out his pain? When Elvis returned to live performing in 1969, he brought a rock and roll band with him, the core of which became the TCB Band. But he also added a full orchestra conducted by Joe Guercio. This combination created a massive, powerful sound that was perfect for the cavernous showrooms of Las Vegas. The orchestra added strings, brass, and a sense of grandeur to his music. It elevated his rock and roll roots into something more epic, more theatrical. In the early 70s, this arrangement was a triumph. The power of the TCB Band, coupled with the sweep of the orchestra and the harmonies of his backing vocalists, created a wall of sound that was thrilling. It was the sound of a king reclaiming his throne. Songs like Suspicious Minds and An American Trilogy became huge cinematic experiences. The orchestra was a symbol of his success, the ultimate show business statement. But as the years went on, the role of the orchestra began to shift. As Elvis's energy on stage began to wane, the massive sound became a kind of crutch. If he was having a bad night, if his voice was weak or his movements sluggish, the sheer volume and energy of the 30-piece orchestra could help carry the show. It could fill the spaces where his own charisma once burned brightest. The sound was so big, so overwhelming, that it could sometimes mask the deficiencies in his performance. This created a tragic paradox. The very thing that made his show sound so powerful was also helping to conceal his growing weakness. The orchestra was a safety net. It ensured that even on his worst nights, the show would still sound impressive. The audience would still get the bombast and the spectacle they paid for, but it also allowed him to coast. It reduced the need for him to be the explosive, unpredictable performer he once was. The show became a well-oiled machine, and he was just one part of it, albeit the most important one. Listen to recordings from 1976 and 1977. Sometimes his voice seems to be fighting to be heard over the immense sound. He is a small human voice in the middle of a musical hurricane. The arrangements are thick, layered, and loud. They leave little room for subtlety or vulnerability. The pain and weariness in his voice are still there if you listen closely, but they are often buried under a mountain of strings and horns. The orchestra that once amplified his greatness was now being used to disguise his decline. It was a sonic curtain that hid the truth of his condition. The passage of time meant that he needed more and more support to get through a show. The orchestra provided that support, but at a cost. It distanced him from his own music and from his audience. He was the center of a huge, expensive production, but he was also lost inside it. The sound was bigger than ever, but the man at the center of it was getting smaller. Number 13, how did divorce change the music? Elvis and Priscilla Presley separated in February 1972, and their divorce was finalized in October 1973. This period marked a significant shift in the emotional tone of his music. Just weeks after the initial separation, in March 1972, Elvis went into the RCA studio in Hollywood and recorded a batch of songs that were drenched in heartache. Among them were Always on My Mind, Separate Ways, and Fool. It was one of the most emotionally raw recording sessions of his career. Always on My Mind is the most famous example. The song, written by Johnny Christopher, Mark James, and Wayne Carson, is a confession of regret from a man who didn't appreciate his partner when he had her. Maybe I didn't treat you quite as good as I should have. You were always on my mind. Elvis's version is not just a sad song, it's a cry of anguish. He sings it with a quiet desperation, his voice filled with a palpable sense of loss. He wasn't just performing a song, he was living it. The timing of the recording, so soon after his own marital breakdown, is no coincidence. It was a public apology set to music. separate ways is even more direct. Someday, when she's older, maybe she will understand why her mom and daddy are not holding hands. The song is a painful look at the impact of divorce on a child, in this case, his daughter Lisa Marie. He delivers the lyric with a weary resignation. It's the sound of a man accepting a painful new reality. This theme of loss and regret would continue throughout his later work. He recorded songs like You Gave Me a Mountain, a dramatic ballad about a man overwhelmed by life's burdens, including a painful separation from his child. He would introduce it on stage by saying, "This is a song I can really relate to." The line between his life and his art was gone. His concerts became a form of public therapy, where he worked through his personal pain in front of thousands of strangers. The divorce seemed to open a new emotional depth in his singing. His performances of these heartbreak ballads were some of the most compelling of his later career. He had always been a great singer of sad songs, from Heartbreak Hotel onwards, but this was different. This wasn't the abstract sadness of a young man. This was the specific, weary sadness of a middle-aged man who had built a family and watched it fall apart. The tragedy is that this new emotional honesty was born from immense personal pain. The passage of time had brought him not wisdom and peace, but heartbreak and regret. His music became a mirror of his life. Before the divorce, his shows were largely celebrations of love and rock and roll. After, they were often laced with a deep, pervasive melancholy. He was still the king, but he was a king who had lost his queen, and he made sure everyone in the audience knew it. The joy had been tempered by a profound and lasting sorrow. Number 12. Was he trapped by his own legend? In any given Elvis show in the 1970s, you were guaranteed to hear a medley of his greatest hits from the 1950s. Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, Jailhouse Rock, All Shook Up. These were the songs that had made him a global phenomenon. For the audience, they were a thrilling trip back in time, a chance to relive the excitement of their youth. For Elvis, they became an obligation, a golden cage. By 1975, he would often rush through these songs, sometimes in a medley that lasted only a few minutes. He had been singing Hound Dog for 20 years. The way he performed these songs in his later years is telling. He would often introduce them with a sense of ironic detachment. He might joke about how old they were or how tired he was of singing them. The performances themselves were often perfunctory. He would sing the words, the band would play the notes, but the fire, the rebellious energy that had defined the original recordings, was long gone. How could it not be? He was a 40-year-old man in a jumpsuit, not a 21-year-old kid in a gold lame suit. The context was gone. The feeling was gone. This was the trap of his own legend. People came to see Elvis, and Elvis meant the 1950s rock and roller. They wanted to see the sneer, they wanted to hear the hits. It didn't matter that he was now a different person, a different artist, with a different voice and a different perspective. He was a nostalgia act, and he knew it. He was forced to compete with a younger, more vital version of himself every single night. This artistic stagnation was frustrating for him. He was more interested in singing contemporary ballads, gospel songs, and new material that challenged him vocally. His passion was evident when he performed a song like An American Trilogy or How Great Thou Art. In those moments, he was fully present, invested, and powerful, but then he would have to return to Teddy Bear, a song he recorded as a 22-year-old for a movie. The contrast was jarring. The passage of time had turned his greatest triumphs into a burden. The songs that had set him free had now become his prison. He was a living museum piece, expected to endlessly replicate the past for a paying audience. This creative inertia contributed to his boredom and his disillusionment with performing. He was an artist who was not allowed to evolve past his most famous creation. The tragedy is that he had so much more to offer. The voice of the 1970s was, in many ways, a more powerful and expressive instrument than the voice of the 1950s. He had the emotional depth to interpret complex material, but he was rarely given the chance. He was stuck singing about not stepping on his blue suede shoes when he was a man grappling with divorce, failing health, and spiritual doubt. He was trapped by the expectations of his own incredible past, forced to play the part of the young rebel long after the rebellion was over. Number 11. Did the world's biggest star die of loneliness? Elvis Presley was almost never alone. From the time he became famous, he was surrounded by a group of friends, family, and employees known as the Memphis Mafia. They were his bodyguards, his companions, his assistants. They lived with him, traveled with him, and were with him almost 24 hours a day. Yet, a deep and profound loneliness permeates his later work and his onstage persona. In a hotel suite with a dozen people, he could be the most isolated man in the room. This loneliness began to manifest itself on stage in the form of long, rambling monologues. Between songs, he would start talking to the audience. Sometimes these were funny stories about the band or his past, but often they would become strange, stream of consciousness rambles. He would talk about numerology, his spiritual beliefs, his throat feeling sore, or whatever else was on his mind. These moments could be awkward and uncomfortable. He would seem to lose his train of thought, the band waiting patiently for him to start the next song. These monologues were a crack in the facade. The polished, professional entertainer would disappear, and for a few minutes, the audience would see a confused, isolated man. He seemed to be desperately trying to make a genuine connection to break through the barrier of his own fame. He was talking at thousands of people, but he wasn't really connecting with them. It was a cry for connection from a man who had everything except normal human interaction. His song choices also reflected this deep sense of isolation. He sang, "I'm so lonesome, I could cry," a Hank Williams classic with a chilling authenticity. He recorded Solitaire, a song about a man so alone he has no one to play cards with. He sang about lost love and fractured relationships. These weren't just songs anymore, they were pages from his diary, read aloud every night. The structure of his life enforced this loneliness. He lived in a bubble. He couldn't go to a grocery store, a movie theater, or a restaurant without causing a mob scene. His reality was the gilded cage of Graceland or a sterile hotel suite. His interactions were with people who were on his payroll. This lack of genuine, equal relationships is a recipe for profound isolation. The passage of time only made it worse. As he got older, his world seemed to shrink. His divorce from Priscilla removed his primary emotional anchor. His health problems further isolated him. He was the king of a kingdom of one. The tragedy is immense. Here was a man who was loved by millions, who could have anything he wanted, but what he seemed to crave most was something his fame made impossible, a simple, quiet, normal connection. The loneliness is a constant, humming undercurrent in his later recordings and performances. It's the sound of a man in a crowded room, shouting to be heard, but feeling like no one is truly listening. Number 10, What Happened to the Boy from Tupelo? Elvis Presley was born in a 2-room shotgun shack in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1935. His family was poor. He grew up shy, devoted to his mother, and deeply immersed in the gospel music of the local church. He was a working-class kid who got a lucky break. The early Elvis, the one who walked into Sun Records in 1954, was a raw, nervous, but electrifying talent. He was a polite, respectful young man who transformed into a force of nature when the music started. He was humble, slightly awkward, and seemed genuinely surprised by his own success. Fast forward 20 years. The Elvis of the mid-1970s was a different being entirely. He was a global icon, a brand, a corporation. He lived in a mansion, flew in a private jet, and was surrounded by paid employees. He wore custom-made jewelry and costumes that cost thousands of dollars. The shy boy from Tupelo was gone, replaced by the king. The contrast is one of the central tragedies of his life. The passage of time did not just age him, it transformed him into something almost unrecognizable from his origins. The raw hunger and ambition of his youth had been replaced by a weary sense of obligation. The spontaneous joy of his early performances had been replaced by the polished, professional, but often hollow spectacle of Las Vegas. On stage in his later years, he would sometimes tell stories about his childhood, about his mother, about growing up poor. In these moments, you could catch a glimpse of the boy he once was. It felt like he was trying to reconnect with that part of himself, the part that existed before the fame, the money, and the pressure. He was trying to remember who he was before the world told him he was a king. His return to gospel music was also a way of connecting with his past. The gospel was the first music he ever loved. It was pure, it was spiritual, and it was tied to his relationship with his mother and his childhood faith. When he sang gospel, his voice had a different quality. The showmanship fell away, and he sang with a humble sincerity. It was the sound of the Tupelo boy peeking through the glittering facade of the Las Vegas superstar. The tragedy is that he could never truly go back. The fame was too immense, the lifestyle too ingrained. He had been Elvis Presley for too long. The simple life he sometimes seemed to yearn for was an impossibility. He was a man disconnected from his own roots, a Southerner who spent most of his time in Las Vegas and on the road. The boy from Tupelo was a ghost that haunted him, a reminder of a simpler time he could see but never touch again. The journey from that two-room shack to the Graceland mansion was the American dream, but it came at the cost of the man who made the journey. Number 9 was gospel, his only escape. Elvis Presley won 3 Grammy Awards in his lifetime. All 3 were for his gospel recordings. His 1967 album, How Great Thou Art, won for Best Sacred Performance. His 1972 album, He Touched Me, won for Best Inspirational Performance. A live performance of How Great Thou Art from 1974 also won in the same category. For a man known as the King of Rock and Roll, it is a telling fact that his only critically acclaimed work, by the standards of the Recording Academy, was in the realm of sacred music. Gospel was more than just a genre for Elvis. It was his spiritual bedrock. It was the music he grew up with, the music he sang with his family, and the music he returned to in private throughout his life. His friends and band members often spoke of late-night gospel sessions in his hotel suites after a show. After 2 hours of singing his rock and roll hits, he would unwind by singing spirituals until dawn. On stage, the gospel numbers were often the most powerful and sincere moments of the show. When he sang How Great Thou Art, it was not a performance, it was a testimony. He would pour every ounce of his vocal and emotional energy into it. The orchestra would swell, the backup singers would soar, and Elvis's voice would ring out with a power and conviction that was often missing from his performances of the old rock and roll hits. He would end the song with his arms outstretched, his eyes closed, in a state of genuine emotional release. This return to gospel in his later years can be seen as a search for meaning and an escape from the pressures of his life. The world of rock and roll in Las Vegas was one of excess, adulation, and artifice. It was a world of temporary highs and deep lows. And gospel music offered a different path. It was about redemption, hope, and connecting with something larger than oneself. It was a way for him to transcend the tawdry reality of his day-to-day existence. As his physical health declined and his personal life became more chaotic, his need for this spiritual anchor seemed to grow. The lyrics of these songs offered comfort. He touched me, oh, he touched me, and oh, the joy that floods my soul. In a life filled with physical pain and emotional turmoil, this was a powerful sentiment. He was a man grappling with his own mortality, and these songs provided a language for his hopes and fears. The tragedy is that this escape was only temporary. The gospel numbers were just one part of the show. After the spiritual climax of How Great Thou Art, he would have to go back to being Elvis, singing Hound Dog and throwing scarves to the crowd. The peace he found in the music was fleeting. It was a brief sanctuary in the middle of a chaotic and self-destructive life. It was the purest part of his musical soul, but it wasn't enough to save him. Number 8. Did Aloha from Hawaii show the first cracks? On January 14th, 1973, Elvis Presley performed a concert at the Honolulu International Center that was broadcast live via satellite to over 40 countries. It was a massive technological feat and a global television event watched by an estimated 1.5 billion people. The resulting album, Aloha from Hawaii via satellite, went to number 1 on the charts. On the surface, this was the absolute peak of his 1970s comeback, a moment of unprecedented global triumph. For the event, Elvis was in incredible physical shape. He had dieted and trained rigorously. He looked like a god, tanned and slim in his white American Eagle jumpsuit. His performance was professional, polished, and powerful. He commanded the stage with an easy confidence, running through a set list of his recent hits, a few classics, and powerful ballads like My Way and An American Trilogy. But if you look and listen closely, the first signs of the coming decline are there. While his voice is strong, there's a certain professional distance in the performance. The raw, dangerous energy of the 1970, that's the way it is, shows is gone, replaced by a more controlled, almost corporate showmanship. The set list is safe, calculated for a mass global audience. There's little room for spontaneity or risk. This was Elvis the institution, not Elvis the rebel. The pressure of the event was immense. Colonel Parker had sold the rights to the show, and Elvis had to be perfect. This pressure to maintain an impossible standard of perfection would take its toll. The Aloha Special was a high watermark that he would spend the rest of his life failing to live up to. After this global triumph, where else was there to go? The only way was down. The songs themselves also hint at a changing perspective. He introduced I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry by saying it was the saddest song I've ever heard. His inclusion of My Way at this peak of his fame is also telling, a song about looking back at the end of a long journey. Even at his zenith, there was a preoccupation with endings and with sadness. The Aloha Special was a snapshot in time. It captured Elvis at the last moment when he could still convincingly project the image of the invincible, superhuman king. He was trim, he was focused, and he was on top of the world. But it was a fragile peak. The effort it took to get there was unsustainable. The passage of time would quickly begin to erode the perfect image presented to the world on that January night. It was a magnificent performance, but it was also the beginning of the end, a brilliant flash before the long, slow fade. Number 7, could you hear his health failing in his voice? Elvis Presley's voice was his primary instrument, and it was a remarkably durable one. Even in his final concerts, when he was visibly ill, his voice could still produce moments of astonishing power and beauty. But it was not the same voice as the one from the 1950s or even the early 1970s. The passage of time and the devastating effects of his lifestyle and prescription drug abuse could be heard in the subtle changes in his vocal delivery. The most obvious change was the deepening of his voice. The playful, high-tenor yelps of his youth were mostly gone. His voice settled into a rich, deep baritone. This was partly a natural result of aging, but it was also likely exacerbated by his weight gain and other health issues. This deeper voice was well suited for the dramatic ballads he favored in his later years, but it lost some of the light, agile quality of his early work. His breathing also became more noticeable on recordings and in live performances. You can hear him taking sharp, sometimes ragged breaths between lines. On stage, he would sometimes be visibly winded after a more demanding number. This was a direct result of his declining physical condition. Singing is an athletic activity, and his body was no longer up to the task of supporting his voice without immense effort. The famous Elvis vibrato also changed. In his youth, it was a tight, controlled quiver that he could apply with precision. In his later years, it became much wider and slower, sometimes sounding more like a wobble or a tremor. This could be incredibly effective on sad songs, adding to the sense of emotional fragility, but it was also a sign of diminished vocal control, a physical manifestation of his failing health. Listen to a song like Unchained Melody from 1977 and compare it to Suspicious Minds from 1969. The power is still there in the later recording, but it is a different kind of power. The 1969 voice is energetic, sharp, and relentless. The 1977 voice is heavier, more labored, and tinged with a deep weariness. It's the voice of a man who is pushing himself to the absolute limit. The tragedy is that his voice was the last thing to go. His body was failing him, his spirit was often broken, but he could still open his mouth and produce that incredible sound. It was his last remaining connection to the artist he once was, but it was an instrument being played by a man who was falling apart. The flaws, the ragged breaths, the heavy vibrato, these were not just vocal tics. They were the audible evidence of a body and a spirit in a state of collapse. They were the sound of time running out. Number 6. Why did he keep covering songs about leaving? A significant portion of Elvis's 1970s set list was made up of cover songs. While he had always recorded songs by other artists, his choices in this later period often revolved around themes of departure, loss, and the end of a love affair. These songs, when sung by a man whose own great love story had recently ended in divorce, took on a powerful and tragic resonance. He performed a searing version of You've Lost That Loven Feelin', the Righteous Brothers classic. The song is a direct confrontation, a plea from a man who knows a relationship is over. When Elvis sang it, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation, it felt intensely personal. He had lived through that exact scenario. Another staple was I Can't Stop Loving You, the Ray Charles standard. It's a song of lingering obsession, about a man who can't move on from a past love. He also sang Bridge Over Troubled Water, a Simon and Garfunkel song about providing support to someone in a time of need. His version was a massive gospel-infused production, but in the context of his own life, it could be heard as a plea for that same kind of support and comfort. He even took on What Now My Love, a dramatic ballad of utter despair after a lover has gone. What now my love, now that you've left me, how can I live through another day? His performances of this song were pure melodrama, but given his own well-documented loneliness and depression, they felt chillingly real. Why did he gravitate towards these songs? On one level, they were simply great songs that allowed him to show off his incredible vocal range and emotional depth. They were crowd pleasers, but on a deeper level, they seemed to be a way for him to exorcise his own demons. He was using the words of other songwriters to tell his own story of heartbreak. The passage of time had brought him to a place of profound loss. His marriage was over, his daughter did not live with him, and his connection to the vibrant youth culture he once defined was gone. He was, in many ways, a man left behind by time. These songs of leaving and being left were the soundtrack to his emotional reality. The tragedy lies in the repetition. Night after night, he would immerse himself in these feelings of abandonment and loss. It was a cycle of public grieving. He was not just singing about leaving, he was reliving it. The songs were a constant reminder of what he had lost, a musical testament to the empty spaces in his life. Number 5, was he laughing at the audience or with them? Elvis's onstage behavior in his final years could be erratic. One of the most common and sometimes unsettling habits was his tendency to laugh in the middle of a song. He would famously break into laughter during the line, "Do you gaze at your doorstep and picture me there? And are you lonesome tonight?" This became a running gag, and audiences would anticipate it, laughing along with him. The 1969 recording of this lawing version became a hit in its own right. In the beginning, these moments seemed spontaneous and charming. They were a glimpse of the playful, human side of the superstar. It was Elvis breaking character, showing the audience that he wasn't taking himself too seriously. It created a sense of intimacy and shared fun. But as time went on, the laughter began to feel different. It could seem forced, or it could appear at inappropriate moments in serious songs. Sometimes it felt less like genuine amusement and more like a nervous tic, a way of deflecting from the emotional content of the lyrics or from his own physical discomfort. It could also come across as a sign of boredom. After singing a song hundreds of times, perhaps the only way to get through it was to make fun of it. There were moments when the laughter felt almost contemptuous. He would flub a lyric and laugh it off, or make a joke at the song's expense. To some, it looked like he was laughing at the audience for taking this old, silly song so seriously. It was a way of creating distance between himself and the material he was obligated to perform. It was the jaded professional mocking the sincere expectations of his fans. This ambiguity is what makes these moments so tragic. Was it the joyful, rebellious spirit of his youth breaking through the polished veneer of the Vegas show? Or was it the cynical, exhausted man showing his disdain for the whole charade? The truth is likely a mixture of both. The passage of time had created a deep well of weariness and disillusionment in him. The laughter was a crack in his professional armor. through it, you could see the complex and contradictory emotions he was dealing with: boredom, amusement, sadness, and perhaps a bit of contempt for the trap he had built for himself. It was the sound of a man who was simultaneously the master of ceremonies and the prisoner of the show. He was laughing, but it wasn't always clear if he was in on the joke. Number 4, did he hate Las Vegas? And Las Vegas was the city of Elvis Presley's great comeback. His run at the International Hotel, later the Las Vegas Hilton, starting in 1969, was a phenomenal success. It redefined him as a top-tier live performer and established a new model for superstar residencies in the city. For a time, Elvis and Vegas were a perfect match. The city's over-the-top glamour matched his own, and the stable engagement allowed him to stay in one place, a relief after years of grinding out Hollywood movies. He signed a long-term contract in 1970 that locked him into performing for 2 month-long engagements in Vegas every year. At first, this was a golden deal, but over time, the city and the routine became a prison. The same showroom, the same dinner show, midnight show schedule, the same audience of high rollers and tourists. It became a monotonous grind. The environment of Las Vegas was also toxic for him. It's a city that runs 24 hours a day, which catered to his chronic insomnia and his habit of turning night into day. It was a place of immense indulgence where anything could be had at any time, which fed his worst impulses regarding food and prescription drugs. The city's artificiality and lack of connection to the real world mirrored and amplified his own isolation. His performances began to reflect his boredom. Critics and even band members noted a decline in the quality and consistency of his Vegas shows as the years went on. Some nights, he would be brilliant, but on other nights, he would be listless, going through the motions. He would cut songs short, ramble on between numbers, and seem disconnected from the performance. The passage of time turned his greatest triumph into his most soul-crushing obligation. He was the king of Vegas, but he was also its most famous employee, contractually bound to show up and perform. The city that had resurrected his career was now draining the life out of him. You can hear the change in the live albums recorded in Vegas over the years. The 1970 album On Stage is electric, full of energy and purpose. Later recordings can sound tired and routine. The excitement of the comeback had faded, replaced by the weary professionalism of a man doing his job. Las Vegas was no longer a stage for his rebirth. It was the gilded cage where he slowly faded away. He may have smiled for the cameras and cashed the checks, but it's hard to believe that, in the end, he didn't grow to despise the city that demanded so much and gave him so little real sustenance in return. Number 3. What does Moody Blue tell us about his state of mind? Moody Blue was the title track of Elvis's final studio album, released in 1977. The song itself was recorded in the Jungle Room in February 1976. It's an up-tempo, contemporary country pop song, a seemingly light piece of music, but the lyrics, written by Mark James, paint a picture of a woman who is dangerously unpredictable and emotionally unstable. She's a complicated lady, so call her my baby Moody Blue. When Elvis sings this song, it's easy to see it as just another pop song about a difficult relationship. But in the context of his life in 1976, it takes on a different meaning. The song is about trying to understand and cope with someone who is volatile and constantly changing. When she's good, she's very, very good. But when she's bad, she's better. This could very well have been a description of his own state of mind. By this point, Elvis's moods were notoriously unpredictable. His behavior could swing from generous and charming to angry and paranoid. This was a result of the cocktail of prescription drugs he was taking for a variety of real and perceived ailments. He was living in a state of chemical-induced emotional chaos. One day he would be full of energy and creative ideas, the next he would be withdrawn and depressed, unwilling to leave his room. The song Moody Blue becomes a kind of unintentional self-portrait. He was the one who was complicated, unpredictable, and moody blue. The upbeat, almost cheerful music of the song creates a bizarre and tragic contrast with the likely reality of his emotional state. It's a pop song about a dark and chaotic inner world. The album Moody Blue itself is a reflection of this fractured state. It's a hodgepodge of studio recordings from the Jungle Room sessions and live tracks from his recent tours. It lacks cohesion and feels thrown together, a product of RCA's desperation to get a new album from an artist who was increasingly unwilling or unable to record. Even the album's existence is a testament to his difficult and unpredictable behavior. The passage of time had eroded his emotional stability. The confident, in-control star of the early 70s was gone, replaced by a man struggling with his own internal demons. Muddy Blue is the title of his final chapter, and it's a tragically appropriate one. It captures the instability and emotional turmoil that defined his last years, all hidden behind the mask of a catchy pop tune. Number 2 was That's the Way It Is, the last time he was truly happy on stage. In the summer of 1970, MGM filmed a documentary about Elvis's return to the Las Vegas stage. The film and the accompanying album was called That's the Way It Is. It captures Elvis at a unique moment in time. The pressure of the initial 1969 comeback was over. He had proven he could still do it. The monotonous grind of the later Vegas years had not yet set in. He was 35 years old, in peak physical condition, and seemed genuinely thrilled to be performing again for a live audience. The film shows him rehearsing with his band, joking around, and working hard to put the show together. He is engaged, energetic, and clearly in charge. He is the creative force driving the music. On stage, he is a dynamo. He is lean, powerful, and full of a joyful, almost explosive energy. The karate moves are sharp and spontaneous. His voice is magnificent, and he sings with a passion and commitment that is breathtaking. Watch him perform Suspicious Minds or Polk Salad Annie in that film. He is completely lost in the music, a conduit of pure rock and roll energy. He is having fun. The smile is genuine. The connection with the audience and his band is palpable. This is not a man going through the motions. This is an artist at the absolute height of his powers, rediscovering his love for his craft. This period in 1970 can be seen as the eye of the hurricane. The wilderness years of the 1960s movies were behind him. The dark, declining years of the mid to late 70s were still ahead. For this brief shining moment, everything was right. He had the maturity of a seasoned performer and the energy of a young man. He had a great band, great songs, and the adoration of the public. The passage of time makes watching That's the Way It Is a profoundly bittersweet experience. We are watching a man who is happy, healthy, and creatively fulfilled. But we know what is coming. We know this perfect moment will not last. The seeds of his decline, the isolation of fame, the demands of the Vegas schedule, the physical toll of performing Norm are already there, just below the surface. This documentary captured the last flash of the vibrant, unstoppable Elvis. It was before the jumpsuits became a prison, before the set lists became rigid, before the monologues became rambling, and before the joy was replaced by obligation. It is a portrait of a man who was, for one last time, completely and utterly free on stage. Number 1, why are the saddest songs his most honest? Throughout his career, Elvis Presley could sing any kind of song. He sang rock and roll, blues, country, pop, and gospel. But his most enduring and powerful performances, especially in his later years, were often his saddest songs. From Heartbreak Hotel in 1956 to Unchained Melody in 1977, he was unparalleled as a singer of sorrow. In his later works, this ability reached a new level of depth and authenticity. When he sang about loss, loneliness, and regret, it felt like he was telling the absolute truth. The slick showmanship of the Vegas production would fall away, and all that was left was the raw emotion in his voice. Songs like Always on My Mind Hurt and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry were not just performances, they were confessions. The passage of time had given him the life experience to inhabit these songs completely. He was no longer a young man singing about an abstract idea of heartbreak. He was a middle-aged man who had lived through a painful divorce, who was estranged from his own past, who was trapped in a lonely and unhealthy existence. The pain in the lyrics was a reflection of the pain in his life. This is the ultimate tragedy hidden in his later works. The happier he was supposed to be, the king in his castle, the world's biggest Star Wars, the less believable his happy songs became. The up-tempo rock and roll numbers often sounded forced, a hollow echo of his vibrant youth. But when he sang about sadness, his voice was filled with a profound and undeniable honesty. The The sad songs were the only place where the man and the myth could meet, where the public image of the king could be set aside for the private reality of the lonely man. In these moments of musical sorrow, he was able to communicate the truth of his own experience in a way he never could in an interview or a conversation. The weariness, the regret, the longing, it was all there in his voice. The passage of time had stripped away his youthful optimism and left him with a deep, resonant melancholy. And it was in expressing that melancholy that he found his most authentic artistic voice. The saddest songs are his most honest, because by the end of his life, sadness was the most honest thing he knew.